Have you ever experienced a silence so deep it seemed to swallow everything around you? That's loneliness. It starts like a gentle breeze that suddenly turns into an overwhelming storm. It begins almost imperceptibly, with small moments of silence that seem harmless. However, as days go by, this emptiness grows, spreading to the deepest corners of the mind until it occupies every available space. But what few admit is that, amidst this darkness, there can be a strange pleasure, the pleasure of being alone with oneself, far from distractions, just with your own thoughts. Could it be that, on some level, we seek this loneliness, even unconsciously? Maybe loneliness brings a kind of freedom that both scares and comforts us at the same time. It's a burden many carry, but few dare to admit. It seeps into the cracks of our daily existence, hides in the pauses of a conversation, in the glances that never happen, and in the moments when we realize that, despite being surrounded by people, there's a void inside us. As Nietzsche observed, those who dance are considered insane by those who cannot hear the music. Perhaps loneliness is like that. It envelopes us so intimately that, even when we're in the middle of a crowd, we're the only ones who hear the deafening silence it brings. In modern life, where we're permanently connected, it's almost ironic to realize how disconnected we feel inside. Jung spoke of the individuation process, where a person needs to isolate themselves to understand their true nature, but the loneliness we're talking about here doesn't have that transformative quality. It's suffocating, crushing, as if the weight of the world is on our shoulders, and each day is just a repeat of the last. The lack of genuine dialogue, of connections that make us feel seen and heard, turns physical presence into a mere formality. We're close yet distant. We live in an age where the touch of a screen is more common than human touch. And in this paradox, loneliness becomes even crueler. Even surrounded by notifications, likes, and messages, what remains is the absence of meaning and depth. Sometimes, loneliness can't be expressed in words. It's a feeling so deep that any attempt to describe it seems to fade before it even begins. Nietzsche once said that all that is profound loves a mask, and maybe that's why many hide this feeling, whether out of shame or the difficulty of finding the right words. Words, after all, seem too small to describe the immense emptiness felt inside. Carl Jung, one of the great names in psychology, helps to understand this process through the concepts of persona and shadow. The persona is the social mask we wear every day, what we show others to be accepted by society, a kind of facade. Our roles as workers, friends, children, among others. It's how we want people to see us, always trying to maintain a proper and controlled appearance. On the other hand, the shadow is the deepest part of our psyche, where we store feelings, desires, and emotions that we prefer to ignore or repress. These shadow elements include our fears, insecurities, or even traits we consider socially unacceptable. Loneliness, then, can result from this conflict between what we show, the persona, and what we hide, the shadow. Often, our need to appear well-adjusted and happy masks the loneliness we truly feel inside. In light of this, attempts at consolation from others can seem empty. Telling someone who feels lonely that they're not alone often comes across as a superficial comfort. After all, loneliness isn't just about the physical presence of others, but about our ability to emotionally connect. And when that connection doesn't happen, words become insufficient. For those on the outside, it's hard to understand what's really going on, and attempts to offer comfort can become just another echo in the void. Emotional distance takes many forms and can be a unique experience for each person. What we often fail to realize is that isolation doesn't only arise from the lack of company, but also from the unique circumstances in which it manifests. It can be subtle, like the feeling that something is missing during moments of fun with friends, or intense, like being in a familiar environment, but feeling like no one truly understands us. There are different ways in which isolation infiltrates our lives. Emotional disconnection can emerge even in the midst of companionship, when, despite being around others, we feel that relationships lack depth. This phenomenon is a reminder that loneliness isn't tied only to the physical absence of people, but to the lack of emotional intimacy. Each stage of life brings its own particular version of this isolation. While a young person might feel lost in their search for belonging, an adult may face it through the exhausting demands of modern life, and older people often encounter this emptiness as the years go by, when support networks and family ties weaken. It's important to note that the experience of emotional distance is dynamic and varies according to life stages and interactions. Loneliness can be brief and fleeting at times, but at others, it can intensify and lead to a deep crisis of identity and connection. It's the many faces of this disconnection that make the feeling so difficult to define and often so challenging to overcome. Isolation doesn't just affect the heart or the mind. It invades the body, as if every part were slowly being disconnected from the vitality of being connected to the world. Have you ever felt that the longer you spend alone, the harder it becomes to break out of that state? It's as if loneliness is a web that tightens with each failed attempt to escape. The impact on emotional life is profound. The person feels increasingly distant, as if they were living in a parallel universe, where the smiles and interactions happening around them seem unreal. And it doesn't stop there. The body also begins to feel the weight of this isolation. Studies show that prolonged isolation can increase stress levels, weaken the immune system, and even harm cardiovascular health. The heart, which should beat with strength and vigor, begins to slow down, as if it were feeling the burden of disconnection itself. Loneliness works like a spiral. At first, it may feel like a mild discomfort, a night when we feel more vulnerable or alone. But little by little, it drags us into a cycle that's hard to break. When disconnection is prolonged, it doesn't just hurt the soul. It corrodes the body, turning what seemed like a passing feeling into a constant, overwhelming presence. However, there are no shortcuts to escape this spiral. The pain of isolation doesn't disappear with simple advice or quick fixes. Perhaps the first step is to recognize that sometimes there are no immediate answers, and it's okay to feel that pain. Each person has their own time to process it, and forcing quick solutions might only add to the burden already being carried. Loneliness is part of the human experience, and accepting its impact doesn't mean surrendering to it, but rather making space to gradually rebuild connections, both with others and with ourselves. We live in an era that pressures us to quickly fix what troubles us. But pain, especially emotional pain, doesn't go away with fast solutions. What if, instead of always seeking an immediate cure, we learn to live with that pain, to allow space for it to exist? This is where acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, comes in, a revolutionary approach developed by Stephen C. Hayes in the 1980s. ACT teaches us that, rather than fighting painful emotions, we can learn to accept them, and in doing so, live a life more aligned with our values and purposes. In ACT, acceptance is not the same as resignation. The concept of acceptance here is seen as the willingness to make room for what bothers us, allowing the pain to be part of our life without trying to eliminate it at all costs. Hayes and his colleagues propose that suffering often arises because we spend so much energy trying to avoid or control unpleasant emotions that we end up trapped by them. ACT suggests that, instead of focusing on eliminating pain, we should direct our energy toward committing to what truly matters to us, our deepest values. There's something profoundly poetic about this approach. Think of acceptance as the idea of walking alongside pain without letting it dictate the path. It's accepting that, yes, pain is part of the journey, but it's not the final destination. ACT teaches us that living a life with meaning is more important than living a life without pain. And by accepting that pain is part of the experience, we make room to live according to what gives us purpose, even while carrying discomfort. This concept is also intertwined with self-compassion, though it goes beyond simply being kind to yourself. ACT invites us to view our struggles with curiosity rather than judgment. It challenges us to treat our moments of pain with the same empathy we would offer a friend, and to move forward, not by trying to erase the suffering, but by moving toward what gives us meaning. It's a commitment to life, despite the pain, And that's what makes this approach so powerful. Allowing yourself to feel vulnerable, as ACT teaches us, is not a weakness. In fact, it's an act of deep courage. Acknowledging that the pain is there, but that it doesn't need to control us, is the first step toward finding a path to reconnection with others, with ourselves, and with what truly matters in our lives. As we learn to embrace the pain of loneliness without trying to immediately erase it, something curious can happen. We begin to realize that this experience, as personal and painful as it is not exclusive to us. As much as isolation may feel unique and overwhelming, the truth is that it's part of the experience of many others. In reality, there's a kind of irony in this. In our loneliness, we're connected to a vast, invisible community of people who also feel the same distance. Have you ever stopped to think about how many people, at this very moment, are feeling the same emptiness? This doesn't mean your pain is any less, but recognizing that loneliness is a shared experience might bring some relief. Jung spoke about the paradoxes of human experience, and perhaps this is one of the deepest. Feeling lonely is, in fact, being part of an invisible network of others who feel the same. Although you may feel disconnected, this same loneliness actually connects you to millions of other people who, even in silence, are going through the same thing. Recognizing that we are not alone in our loneliness doesn't solve the problem, but it can soften it. Instead of carrying the weight as something that isolates us completely, we can begin to see this pain as part of something larger, a common human experience. Maybe, in this understanding, we can find small ways to open ourselves up to allow this vulnerability to transform into an invitation for reconnection, whether with others or with ourselves. Loneliness, though painful, doesn't need to be a burden carried alone. The simple act of recognizing that this experience is shared by many is already an important step in gradually beginning to rebuild connections. Loneliness, in all its forms and depths, is a difficult experience to bear. There are no easy solutions, and it's okay to acknowledge that. Along this path, what we can do is create a safe space, both for ourselves and for others, where the pain is welcomed, not rejected. Because, in the end, loneliness is not something that needs to be quickly fixed, but rather understood. By accepting that loneliness is part of the human experience, we can begin to see that relief doesn't come from rushing to overcome it, but from the ability to embrace and give time to the process. Creating this space for reflection allows us to see that we are not alone in our loneliness, and that, with patience and kindness, we can gradually rebuild the connections we lacked. What might be missing is a place where we allow ourselves to feel what we need to feel, without judgment, without haste. If you've made it this far, I invite you to reflect. How has your journey with loneliness been? How can we start treating ourselves with the same compassion we offer to others? Sometimes, the best answer isn't in words, but in the silence that welcomes what we don't yet know how to express. If this reflection resonated with you, feel free to share your thoughts or simply allow yourself to reflect on what was said. Loneliness doesn't disappear overnight, but by creating spaces of acceptance, we take the first step toward reconnecting, both with others and with ourselves.